Welcome to the first session of our IDP speaker series for 2021. My name is H. Christian Breed, and I'm the Deputy Director here at the CIDP and your host for today's talk. Before I introduce our speaker, please remember to submit all questions in the chat feature as part of this webinar, and following Chris's remarks, we'll have a Q&A driven conversation for about 20 minutes or so. And we'll end this by about 1 p.m. this afternoon. So let's get to it. A clinical associate professor at the New York University, Chris Ankerson has a unique blend of practical experience and scholarly chops. A graduate of the London School of Economics and the Royal Roads Military College, Chris served as an infantry officer in the PPCLI, I won't hold that against him, I promise, and deployed on UN peacekeeping operations and NATO missions during his 12 years of service. After which he hung up his uniform and after graduate school, began working with the United Nations in various roles and positions that saw him travel far afield around the world. He joined the team at NYU in 2017 and has been teaching and researching ever since. He has expertise on topics of transnational security and military culture and has an extensive publication and speaking record, including with us here at the CIDP. It's my great pleasure to welcome back Chris to our speaker series. And Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks to CIDP for having me back. I just want to say that I have given a version of this talk before, but this has been updated and slightly more Canadianified for the current audience, and I'm very happy to be sharing this. Let me just share my screen with you all here. What I want to talk about today is the idea of using war as a frame for understanding our response to COVID-19. This research that I'm presenting today takes part of as part of a larger COVID-19 working group supported by the National Science Foundation. And it's going to look at three broad questions. What do we see? How do we explain that, or what's going on? And then finally, what are the implications of that being answered under the question, so what? So what do we see? The response to COVID-19, not just locally, but generally speaking around the world, is being portrayed as a war in some fashion or another. And this has certain implications. One is a framing device. The second is that that framing device itself has a disciplining or a taming effect. And unfortunately, it also has a particular blaming aspect to it. Let's go through that in some detail. Now, again, the previous version of this presentation that I gave, it's been very interesting to track the amount and the diversity of the use of this war metaphor. So these are all new examples, but it's a movable feast. It's a daily update I could be doing to this. So here we can see in Seoul, for example, the South Korean health minister describing Seoul as a COVID-19 war zone in December. Using this idea of a real war as an analog or a comparison, we can see that on the day of infamy on December 7th in the United States, it was said that we're having a repeat of Pearl Harbor every day. There's been that many deaths happening every day within the United States, and therefore there's, the implication is there's a need to react accordingly. More recently in California, which has become, at least in the United States, a bit of the epicenter, it's being described as World War III. The number of LA County medical facilities that are already over capacity has led many to come to this understanding. And, Time believes that the US is losing the war on COVID-19. Now, that's an interesting use of the war as a negative frame, but we've also started to see the use of war as a particular positive frame. So, for example, the UK readies for V-Day as its first shots in the war on coronavirus. It's the first batch of its inoculations was branded or tried to frame it as this triumphant occasion, harkening back to the Second World War, using V-Day to kind of be a substitute for both D-Day, but also implying this idea of victory or VE, Victory in Europe Day. So again, the war frame very active in the United Kingdom. Here in the United States, for example, this idea that vaccines would be the weapon that will end the war, and even extending that there's a vaccine arsenal. So we see this very martial use of language as a way of describing what's going on, both negatively and more optimistically within the response to COVID-19. Well, what does that mean? Okay, we see this, we hear this, and we can see it in speeches, we can see it in journalism, we can see it in official proclamations from various governments. What does it actually do? Well, the idea of any kind of framing device is usually it tries to focus our attention, and in this sense, focus our efforts on a particular problem or solution set. So, for example, here in Canada, we can see this. I would say rather rather crudely drawn poster trying to evoke some of the feeling that is associated or was associated with World War I war posters. So here, we're doing our part, are you doing yours? And this is an almost image for image copy of a famous World War I poster, trying to get people on the home front to recycle and buy war bonds and things like that. More kind of graphically and more or less ambiguously, we can see this official poster, the idea masks on Canada, again using a very famous evocative wartime poster, recycling it in a sense. Rather than fighting on the battlefield, we're now talking about masks being a means of defeating COVID-19 here at home. One of the problems with that is that, along with this idea of disciplining within a war frame, we tend to see the need for and expectations of winners and losers, enemies and allies within a war frame, which probably isn't appropriate when we're talking about a community health issue like fighting a disease. So Cynthia Enloe has said that while it's not always the case, that oftentimes wars bring out, not just fighting, but we tend to see other, let's call them collateral issues: sexism, racism, homophobia, autocracy, secrecy, and xenophobia that often go along with what happens when we're fighting wars. And her concern would be that we might start to see that even as we go into this metaphorical war against COVID. So the United States president, for a few more days, President Trump very famously doesn't refer to or hasn't referred to it as the coronavirus, but calls it the Wuhan flu, or in this case, this is a picture of a speech that he gave where he crossed out corona and inserted Chinese, very much blaming or attributing blame to the pandemic on China. That has extended, unfortunately, to a racist connotation that Asians or those of Chinese extraction are somehow either carriers of the disease or it's somehow to blame for this. And earlier on in 2020, there was a social media campaign, hashtag I am not a virus, by Asian Americans and Asians living in America, trying to show that, look, it's got nothing to do with us. Very famously, here we see the commander of the Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier, Captain Crozier, who decided to kind of buck the system, as it were, or go against this framing as COVID as a wartime response, and said, "I've got six sailors on my ship. I'm going to turn around, abort my mission, and come back to land to get them the kind of medical attention they need." And he was disciplined for that, trying to escape that frame of COVID as a matter of national security is not easy to do. And sadly, even some of the more optimistically positive aspects of COVID-19 as a war, for example, you've heard it all, this idea of we're all in this together, turns out not to be true either. Women, for example, have been disproportionately affected globally by unemployment as a result of COVID-19, due to the kind of infamous double duty, the double day that women often have to do, the emotional and domestic labor that they do on top of their normal jobs. BBC reports it's about nearly between 1.8 and 2 times as many women have been affected by COVID from an economic and employment perspective than their male counterparts. And the disparities go a little bit further. Certainly down here in the United States, President-elect Biden at the time of his presidential debate came out with the astonishing statistic that 1 in 1,000 African Americans has been killed because of coronavirus. This was a shocking revelation. People disputed it, but it was fact checked, and indeed that was the case. So to say that we're all in this together discounts or smooths over the idea that men and women are not impacted by COVID in the same way. Either are white and black and other communities of color, at least here in the United States. It's not necessarily a national unity type experience. So what's going on? What can we see that goes behind this? What kind of academic lenses, for example, can we use to explain what's going on? Well, the first is this idea of securitization, introduced by Barry Buzan and Oli Weaver in 1999, that it's possible to take any issue, a public health issue, regardless, some kind of political issue, and turn it into a security issue. And by that, there needs to be a speech act. There needs to be an attempt to convince somebody that there's an existential threat that is bearing down on some referent object. And that referent object can be, for example, the state, the nation, a particular way of life. And the goal is to move that issue into the realm of emergency politics, where normal rules don't apply. So fast-tracked funding, suspension of the normal rules, the normal political debates, for example. That would be the goal of trying to securitize an issue, rather than leaving it amongst the normal debates of the day. If you can be successful in securitizing an issue, it gets some kind of trump in the small t version of that word treatment. And therefore, we can see this process. Some securitizing agent introduces this existential threat to a particular referent object, suggests a particular security actor that might be the best approach to it, tries to convince an audience, and if they're successful and that audience has the ability to grant them this special category, they move into the realm of emergency politics. And I think we've seen that fairly successfully in terms of how COVID-19 has been dealt with. And this is largely because of the power of the metaphor that we use when we start to look at war as a frame. And metaphors are not just parts of speech, but as George and Lakoff have defined in 1980, they really do have the power to define our reality. And they push us not necessarily towards truth, but appropriate action. And this has been picked up a lot within a realm of relatively new social science called affect theory, which is about how do we create emotions? How do people actually create emotions? And this is meant to go beyond necessarily what is written down. So taking social science beyond the actual text of what we see. So it's not just what's written on a poster or what's written in a headline or what's been said in a speech, but how does that actually have an effect on a particular group of people? So does it make you feel jealous? Does it make you feel angry? Does it make you feel sentimental? And the metaphors that have been used clearly, I think a case can be made by framing it as a war. There's an attempt to create these kinds of emotions amongst the populace. So what? Well, who cares? What does it really make any difference? I mean, it's a nice academic exercise to look at this, but what are some of the more clear implications of this? I think the first is that a war type metaphor has the consequence, intended, I think unintended, of transferring the focus not from communities, but towards this idea of national security. That it's really no longer an issue about making sure that children are fed or elderly people are taken care of, but somehow we turn this into a matter of national unity and even patriotism, which is a bit of a distorted focus. Securitization largely has the unfortunate side effect of establishing mistrust if it's not used correctly. And here we have a very famous example of Colin Powell being at the Security Council of the United Nations, trying to securitize the issue of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case, and there was a large amount of mistrust that came along with it. If the frame and the metaphor that are used are inappropriate, either intentionally or unintentionally, it can really make it difficult to trust people again down the line, which when we are dealing with mistrust in the government can be quite problematic in a domestic sense. Moreover, it sets expectations. When we talk about a war, when we refer back to World War I and World War II, and most of the imagery that's used to compare COVID-19 to a war draws on that kind of imagery, we expect some kind of victory. There's going to be winners and losers, as I said. It's not going to be a long, drawn out, protracted risk management exercise. It's going to actually have some kind of definitive ending, and that can be perhaps wrong-headed. We may not be in a situation, even after years of vaccinations, where this this coronavirus or the next coronavirus, we may have to live with this as a management issue forever. We may have to incorporate vaccinations, for example, into our daily lives, let alone masks and social distancing, rather than having a definitive end date where we can declare victory. And unfortunately, sometimes that war metaphor can lead expectations of that kind. I think one of the ones I want to discuss in some detail today is this idea. I don't know who Ben Britton is, but I think he expresses it very clearly, and it's a very widespread feeling that, well, you know, one of the expectations is if this is a war, why don't we just get the army to do it? Why isn't the army in charge, as Mr. Britton says, in charge of vaccine logistics and distribution? And he signs this on behalf of everyone. And I think this is genuinely a question that many people had, and not for no reason. If it's a war, then go army, right? That makes sense. And if we look at these countries, the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and Canada, and those are the countries I'm mainly focused on in my research, there has been a somewhat differentiated, but also quite common use of the military to do a number of issues, ranging from research and development to PPE distribution and then sometimes production, medical support, direct medical support, as well as logistics. We've also seen some more ancillary kind of generic things like command and control. So establishing a command center or operation center that's able to do some tracking. In Australia, they've used the military to actually enforce compliance, which is not happened in other jurisdictions necessarily. In New Zealand, they used the military to effect tracing. And in the UK and Canada, which I'll talk about shortly, they've actually used psychological operations troops to have a particular role, which might not have been expected. So everybody's aware of kind of the big direct support that we've seen in the United States. Questions also in Israel, surprisingly, about what role the IDF should have in managing the COVID crisis. In Australia, you won't be able to read all of this, but it's not really the point. There's an enormous amount, you can see here, of roles that were and tasks that were assigned to the military. Surge capacity in relation to vehicle checkpoints, for example, assisting the police in enforcing stay-at-home orders, as well as testing and logistics. In New Zealand, that has had a very robust response and a very effective response to COVID-19 after one notorious issue with border management. Someone was led into the country probably not correctly. Prime Minister Ardern took that role away from the civilian border management agency and gave it to the military, which was quite, at the time, seen as quite escalatory. In the United Kingdom, on top of a lot of other things, they used the 77th Brigade, which is a psychological operations unit, to affect what they called influence and outreach by monitoring and trying to counter disinformation amongst the population. And we can see that that's now gone beyond its original context, which was to hopefully prevent, for example, the Russian state from interfering and using this as an opportunity to sow disinformation. But it's now again, this is a bit inflammatory, but from the Times of London, army spies to take on anti-vax militants. And I think that is probably a bit of a surprise that people wouldn't have necessarily expected the military to be doing you know, in March, for example. I think logistics, people would have expected, perhaps even assistance with PPE distribution, but to actually be involved in this kind of a campaign of disinformation probably was unexpected. In Canada, a little bit closer to home, we can see, for example, there's been this idea of using the military to do tasks for which there aren't necessarily other capable bodies to respond. So Canadian Armed Forces soldiers going up to a First Nations community in northern Manitoba to provide assistance. Very famously, we of course have the long-term care facility assistance that was provided in Ontario and Quebec. I'd like to talk about this a little bit, this case in particular, perhaps in the Q&A, but I think it really is illustrative of the kind of slippery slope that happens when we start to bring militaries in on the basis of capacity and their ability to do things. There are sometimes unintended consequences down the road when it comes to, in this case, for example, the military being put in a position to provide feedback, shall we say, or even critique or audit on a civilian process, which again, we wouldn't necessarily think that the military would be in a situation or should be put in a situation to do that. And of course, there are Hippocratic Oath issues involved in this, but imagine if the military was called out to respond to a forest fire in a province, for example, and criticize that province for having inappropriate levels of readiness and wasn't able to provide the kind of competence at the provincial level, we probably wouldn't be overly happy about a military making those kinds of observations. And yet we happily put the military into this position where it needed to do so earlier this year. No news to anybody in Canada, but we have had this use or deployment of the military in support of the Civilian Public Health Agency of Canada to provide distribution assistance. Here, General Fortin being used in that role. But we've also seen provinces kind of tapping into this as well. The assumption that a retired general officer would be a good fit for this, bringing back the former Chief of Defense Staff to take this role at a provincial level is again, I think, indicative of a natural expectation given the way in which COVID-19 has been portrayed. But more worryingly, beyond, again, these issues of capacity, we start to see where, like in Britain, we start to see perhaps some more worrying issues here. So reported by David Pugliese in the Ottawa Citizen, a Canadian military intelligence unit, which is probably not necessarily the best way of describing that, but Canadian Armed Forces personnel data mined social media accounts of Ontarians during the pandemic in order to see, for example, the kinds of disinformation and responses to vaccination and quarantine orders. Again, I'm not sure that's where necessarily we would feel comfortable having our military operate, or that we would have expected earlier on. And I think you can make an argument, as some have, that this idea that once you start to put yourself into this war framework, there's an expectation that, well, if that could be handled in a particular way, then perhaps there's license to handle other things. And again, without getting into the details too much, there have been occasions where perhaps liberties have been taken with this understanding of what it means to be operating domestically with military forces in Canada. So what are some of the implications of this? Well, just because something becomes securitized, does it necessarily mean it has to be militarized? And again, I think it's not unexpected that is the case, but does it have to necessarily be the case? Will we start to see, or I think we can already see that, generally speaking, this is maybe perhaps part of a larger trend towards the militarization of many previously civilian activities, such as aid delivery and policing. And around the world, there have been a lot of scholarly work done on what happens when you militarize things like aid delivery overseas, or when you start to introduce military equipment and language and concepts into things like domestic policing. Another implication that is worthy of kind of looking at is do we start to change the way we view security? And I think there's a fruitful conversation that can be had here. Do we start to change our focus away from what we might have considered national and international security towards more things like domestic and human security? So are we going to see an increased focus on non-traditional roles for the Canadian Armed Forces, for example, due to climate change? So are we going to have more forest fire fighting and flood response and pandemic response in the future, helping out communities that are affected domestically, rather than this expeditionary use of our military forces to do peace support or return to great power conflict type orientation? I think that's an appropriate conversation to be had, and it can't really be answered by fiat. It's not really going to be the military that says we don't do windows, we don't fight forest fires. If that's what Canada wants their military to be all about, and they understand what the pros and cons of that are, it's completely legitimate for that to be the case. But it would be a reorientation in terms of equipment, in terms of funding, in terms of focus. And again, we start to see this war metaphor, not only used for COVID, but here we can see Seth Klein, writing about the BC in this case needs a wartime approach to address the climate emergency. So this framing device, this idea that we can get serious and really put our best foot forward, is a way that is a particularly seductive approach to public policy. And I think another implication is, if this is the case, if we're going to be moving into a world where we need to be more worried about domestic and human security because of things like climate change and other things, do we need a quick, capable, and reliable task force? Does it always have to be the military that does that? Should we take this opportunity once we've got beyond the immediate needs, where of course there are troops, quote unquote, standing by to assist? Is there a logic in saying, well, we need to develop other kinds of response capability? More widely, I think if we want to get away from, I think some of the more nefarious aspects of a war framing, we can choose different frames. As the president of Germany said very early on in this, the pandemic is not a war. So let's use different frames. There have been other metaphors that get used. Sadly, sports metaphors are kind of one of the favorites, treating this as a marathon, not a sprint, for example. But there are other ways of using this to focus on community health, to talk about taking care of your neighbor, for example, rather than necessarily focusing it as a war. Certainly, if we're going to be in a particular war type frame, this is not the time to reduce oversight. We do need to set clear boundaries about where we are happy with and comfortable with military activity and where we aren't, and setting some very clear definitional and legal boundaries about what does it mean to say send the military in to respond to something. Does that include surveillance? Does that include other kinds of activities or not? And I think, as Mary Dudziak here says, the problem with wartime is it really does open up a lot of possibilities. And governments tend to expand their power when they're given these kinds of emergency situations. And again, I would double down on what I said earlier. As Rosa Brooks has noted in the United States, the problem becomes, if you just rely on the military to solve your problems, regardless of what those problems are, it's a bit of a self-licking ice cream cone, that you don't bother to invest in other kinds of response and resilience because we'll just get the military to do it, whether it's reserves or active duty, regular force troops. Rosa Brooks says, it's really a problem that if the only functioning government institution you have, or it's perceived that way, then everything starts to look like war. And that becomes this again, virtuous or vicious cycle. And I would recommend anybody who's interested in following up on this, these two very powerful books, one by Mary Dudziak, who I've already recommended, Wartime, as well as Rosa Brooks's book, How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything. That's the end of my formal remarks, and I'm very looking forward to discussing stuff with you, Christian, and taking some questions from the audience.
Right on, Chris. Thank you so much for that. While I wait for the questions to start to be populated into the Q&A widget at the bottom of the screen for those of you that are attending the webinar, I want to give you an opportunity, Chris, to do a little deeper dive into Op Laser. You had flagged that in your talk as something you wanted to go a little more into, and I'm really intrigued by this interesting dilemma in civil military relations, it would appear, about the military as public and political critic of what is
Yeah.
effectively domestic issues. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I think I think the way people generally start the approach to this is capacity based, right? We have a problem. We need something to solve that. Who's hanging around? Who's standing by with a reliable, chain of command, the ability to communicate, the discipline to be able to deal with things, and in this case, actually also have medical expertise to be able to go in and do that. And that makes a certain amount of sense. And I am in no way saying that this was, illegal or inappropriate. I think the response from a capacity lens and a capability lens makes a lot of sense. I think it illustrates, though, the kind of unintended consequences and the very odd position that the military ended up finding itself. And again, through I don't think they overstepped their boundaries. I think they were put in a very difficult position where once they found the Dickensian, to be frank, kind of situations in those long care facilities, they saw the need to report that, both from a medical uh, you know, uh, from a medical kind of logic, but also from this is what's going on. But again, I'm not sure, normally if we said, hey, the military is going to come in and, check your homework or supervise what you're doing, we wouldn't like that. We would say, well, hang on a second, that's not how things work in a liberal democracy. Like I said, if we sent troops out on Op Lentis and they said, by the way, province X has a crappy forest fire management process and here's our report on that, we would kind of say, oh, that's a bit overstepping the boundaries. But we put these forces in that position, in a position to do that. And again, it's about realizing that the next time. And if you want to avoid that, do provinces need, for example, some kind of expanded healthcare capability, or do they turn to something like the Red Cross in the future, which is also a group of volunteers who have some limited medical capability, perhaps, to be able to provide those kinds of things. I think we've seen, for example, the way that the military is sometimes used for a get out of jail free card. So cities around Canada who don't take adequate preparations for snow removal, who say, well, it's going to be once in a decade snowstorm, I'm not going to kind of pay for the kind of money that I need for overtime or even to pay commercial entities to do it. We'll just call the military in to do that. And again, from a capacity sense, that makes sense. But what is that actually saying, as you mentioned, on other dimensions of civil military relations? And I think this is just gone to show that things don't necessarily proceed solely on that capacity basis. And again, you know, Ontario would like to know, how is the feedback going? What are people thinking about these kinds of stay-at-home orders or wear a mask orders? Hey, these guys are able to monitor social media. Let's ask them to do it. From a capacity perspective, it makes sense. And I'm sure it was innocuous. But do we really want military organizations using their capabilities that they maybe have developed for different purposes, for adversarial purposes overseas, or even in a counterinsurgency framework where they have been working in the last 20 years, where you want to monitor what the population is doing in terms of how well are we affecting the hearts and minds? Do we want to kind of cut and paste that into a domestic framework? I'm not sure that Canadians would be happy with that. Now, I grant that if that is what people are happy to do, because this is such an emergency that's the case, then by all means, let's have that conversation and let's do that very purposefully. I would say that given the reaction, even by the military chain of command, once that story came out, that was not seen as appropriate and was curtailed, it would be a good example of the fact that a line was crossed somewhere. And I think beyond COVID, we need to be a little bit conscious of the fact that some of the thinking now within the foreign policy and security world, both in allied countries and in Canada, is that we are moving into another forever war, another persistent conflict with China and Russia, for example, where we will constantly be and need to be on guard for disinformation, so-called below the threshold or hybrid or gray zone warfare. What is that going to mean if we are always on the lookout, if we always need to be interpreting things in terms of this greater conflict with other countries' milieu? Does that also start to bleed away these boundaries between domestic, international, between what is a military role and what would perhaps need a court order by somebody else to do. And yet, well, I want to make sure the Chinese aren't exploiting this. I want to make sure the Russians aren't behind this. Does that kind of logic creepingly lead us to, hey, there's a war on, just you're just going to have to suck it up. We need to know what's going on. Is that the kind of slippery slope that we're entering into? And we should be aware of that and have those kinds of conversations before we get ourselves into that situation, I think.
Oh, that's a great answer. And I think I wonder, especially with the COVID case and the long-term care facilities, if it's not a question of competing professional obligations, given the unique community within the Canadian Armed Forces that we deploy to that particular scenario.
Oh, absolutely.
They're medical practitioners.
Yeah, the Hippocratic Oath,
Yeah.
et cetera, is certainly an impetus. But again, was that thought through before
Right.
putting people into that position? And I would hope now that that has happened once. The next time it's like, hey, by the way, let's send. Oh, hang on a second. What are some of the branches and sequels that might come out of this? What are some of the contingencies that might arise? What if, for example, sending Canadian soldiers to a First Nations community, what are we going to see? What are those soldiers going to be exposed to? What are they going to need to report on? And how are we going to manage that? Right? Not to say there should be cover-ups by no means, but if we're going to put people in positions of professional obligation, whether that's as a citizen or as a human being or as a medical professional, are we prepared for that kind of consequence? So what does it mean when that gets reported to or by the military chain of command? I mean, again, that's not the kind of civil military relations kind of stuff that we've had to deal with here in Canada before.
Right.
Happens in other countries all the time. Doesn't necessarily happen here.
I wonder though, do you think that's going to cause, say, provincial premiers and provincial executives to maybe think twice before calling out and requesting support from the military?
Well, I mean, what's been very interesting about COVID-19, I think a general observation we can make globally has been the lack of lessons learning or lessons being learned. So if you were an Italian doctor or civil affairs, official in February, March of last year, you would think, well, at least people will learn from our example. And yet we haven't necessarily seen that. But so did the Manitoba provincial authorities hesitate to call out the military to handle an unsolvable problem that they had based on the experience that both Manitoba and Quebec had? I don't think so. When through whatever process they weren't able to find any other solution to that issue, they turned around and kind of hit that easy button. And this is what Rosa Brooks says, if the military becomes the Walmart of society, where if you need it, just go look there first, that's not really the situation she thinks is a good idea, right? If the easy button for a province, because it's cheaper, someone else is paying the bill, it's already built and we haven't had to do it, whatever the circumstances are, that's, and I'm willing to give people a pass, let's say the first time, right? But what are we doing about it now? Do we think we need Katimavik 2? Do we need to boost up the public health authority in Canada to have its own battalions of deployable, health people? Do we want to talk about a national service entity other than the military that does these kinds of things, or is that inefficient? Are we going to say, listen, the military already gets the largest piece of disposable government spending federally, so guess what? When emergencies happen, you're going to do it. And that's fine. And I think we should say that and allow everybody to be aware of what that means in terms of both civilian debate, but also military preparation, right? Are we recruiting the right kind of people? Are we training people the right way? Right now, the expectation is I'm going to, teach you how to shoot and you can drop your rifle, pick up a shovel and go put out a forest fire. Now that's, the amateur tradition, and there's good reasons that 130 people in a rifle company with a chain of command and supervision and communications can do those kinds of things. But are they the best forest fighters? Should we be training them to? Should you get a 3-week, training course on how to manage wildfires? If that's what you're going to do every summer, it seems to me that eventually that becomes something no longer as an ad hoc task, but there's some kind of op lentis preparation phase, that the same way we would go through certain amounts of skills and drills before we deployed people on peacekeeping operations, for example. So those are the kinds of conversations. I don't think I'm not proposing one answer, but I think let's have those conversations rather than saying, oh my gosh, we've got, the cupboard's empty, we got to press the green button and get the military out to do it. That's going to repeat itself if we don't have these kinds of conversations now.
Oh, Chris, I'm getting flashbacks to my first domestic operation as a young platoon commander in Halifax after the Hurricane Juan ripped through. And our most precious asset in that week-long operation to clean up the city of Halifax was soldiers qualified to run chainsaws, which came from our pioneer platoon, which is, of course, I think, as far as I understand, those are still not part of an infantry battalion's order of battle any longer. But those were like gold for that week that we were in Halifax.
Right. And I think, that's an
that.
interesting example of what you have on your tool belt at the time, right? The availability of heavy equipment, large, capacity vehicles that can move people around and stuff around. But I'll give you another example, the Red River floods in 1997. Again, it's a come as you are affair, right? The military shows up to do a job, doesn't really necessarily have any training to do it, is able to kind of leverage its general purpose organizational skills. However, there was I think a pathology of treating the river, for example, as the enemy and templating it within an intelligence framework about, we were getting reports from the intelligence side about the crest will be coming then. And it was very much treated as if this was some kind of, invasion, as opposed to hydrographic expertise. I'll give you another example. In that largely engineer heavy kind of activity, we stuck to the military doctrine of the infantry. The combat arms units were the supported units and the engineers were the supporting units. It actually didn't make any sense. We should have said, you know what? 1CR, for example, you're the lead, you're going to be the supported agency, and us infantry battalions have spare hands and people who can operate a shovel effectively. You tell us what to do. But we stuck to the doctrinal template and tackled that problem with a particular mindset, which, again, if it's once in a century flood, okay, that makes sense. But I think people would, the evidence is op lentis is now a standing task. And, people like General Eyre have wondered, what does that mean in terms of opportunity costs for other aspects of the operational package that the Canadian Armed Forces has to be prepared to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think there's some fantastic discussions on military culture we could have about this, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole just yet. What I'd like to do is try to hit a couple of these other questions. One in particular that I think is interesting, and we just want to roll it up a bit to a sort of much higher level of analysis and go back to the securitization metaphor, not metaphor, but act that we're witnessing and that you've recounted. And the question was around the lines of, do you see this as feeding into the challenges we're having with vaccine distribution and acceptance of vaccines, and that this misinformation has been weaponized, and we're seeing that same sort of those same sort of analogies at play now when we're talking about building general public trust in and around a relatively new vaccine.
So the question is the military's deployment kind of feeding into that?
Well, just the securitization in general, not so much the fact that the military was deployed. We're sort of rolling it up a little higher level. But
I mean, sadly, the issue of trust in fill in the blanks has been on the down trend in most advanced democracies, whether it's trust in experts, trust in politicians, has really, been on a downward climb. One of the few institutions, generally speaking, that has not suffered that is the military. It tends to be seen as, either out of place, out of mind. It doesn't get a negative view, or in some countries like the United States, it's 70-80% public support. Vaccinations have long been, certainly for the last 20 or 30 years, a hot button issue about whether there should be wholesale acceptance and use of them. There's been a aspect of societies in the West that have not wanted to do that, either because they actually look into the health risks, or they don't, if the government tells me to do it, I don't want to do it. What it ends up doing, I think, by involving the military, is whatever that halo effect, negative or positive, is now going to some extent be transferred onto the military. So, let's use somebody like General Hillier, because he's retired, right? Appointed by Premier Ford as the vaccine czar, is either going to do his reputation good or bad, depending on how this goes, right? And some of that will be beyond his control. He's already complained that, distribution at the provincial level has dependencies at the federal level, which makes sense. But also, there's going to be a certain amount of this suck it and see. Do we really know the effectiveness of these vaccines against later variants, these new strains, et cetera? And while elected political officials should take the rap for those kinds of things, if you start involving unelected appointed military people on the basis that they have the expertise, they can make this happen, they know how to do difficult logistical problems, they're going to inherit the success or failure of that larger exercise, which a cynic would say maybe the whole point. Hey, give this off to the military and let them wear it. Or it's unintentional, which now all of a sudden, well, we thought you were pretty good and maybe you won the Cold War, but you lost the war against COVID-19. Is there going to be a rebalancing of that appreciation and good reputation? Which then when you, I don't know, pull the alarm and say, hey, the Russians are coming through the Arctic Circle, would that be, well, you were wrong about COVID, I don't know if I trust you. Yeah, of course you want more ships, more guns. It's going to be, fed into a more cynical loop, let alone how this might become party politicized, right? Depending on who's doing the relying and who starts to kind of put their imprimatur on some of these things, we start to be perhaps dragging the military into a party political fight rather than a simple, quote unquote, technical problem. And I think, to me, that's the one big thing that needs to be realized here. The dimensions to which these things have a technical or operational problem, where capacity is the answer, that's always going to be a component of it. But there's a larger political dimension that we're just maybe not aware of. So putting the military into a position where it needs to then justify why it turned left and didn't turn right, why it said yes to giving people holidays or not, there's going to be political fallout from that. And it's not the kind of thing that we normally expect our militaries to have to deal with. So as we put them more and more into routine use, if that's the way we go with this, what is that going to do for that kind of reputation that they haven't had to worry about in the past?
Excellent. Interesting. Sort of to build on that a little bit, we touched on the intergovernmental challenges here, and I want to do a little deeper dive on that and specifically focus in on the work of Major General Fortin. And in terms of what do you think are some of the challenges he's going to be facing in terms of intergovernmental relations in distributing the vaccine across Canada?
I mean, first let me say, I hope, that General Fortin does an amazing job. I wish the individual absolutely no ill will. And I think we had an interesting conversation last night on a panel talking about the nomination of a former four-star general to be the next Secretary of Defense down here in the United States. And there's a large argument that talks about, well, there's a personal dimension. Is that individual in and of themselves the right person for that job? Then there's another structural dimension, which is it a good idea to put a military officer, a general, into that kind of position in the first place? And then there's the wider issue of why would we have thought that was a good idea in the first place? Is it something to do with this halo effect, this reverence for the military? They can do anything. And if so, maybe that's, not overly helpful. So I think if we focus on the first two issues, General Fortin is an absolutely capable individual who will spend all of the brain cells, stomach lining, and caffeine required to make this on any problem as workable as possible. Not to sound like an economist, but there are going to be externalities outside his control, right? As I said, new waves, variants, compliance by people, take up of the vaccines, manufacturing errors, distribution errors that are going to be beyond what he or anyone else in that position could actually do. Interestingly, if we move to that second, bucket, why would we get a general to do this? Interesting, we picked a combat arms officer to do this. Again, it wasn't a logistical officer, it wasn't a medical officer to deal with this. It was decided that once a military officer did need to do this, we would, and at least the idea that was said publicly was, logistical experience. Well, we picked someone with combat arms experience, command experience, which of course includes campaigning and the idea of supporting and sustaining a campaign through the use of logistics in the supply chain. But we didn't pick a logistician to do it. And I think there's got to be an interesting discussion about why that is the case. Again, military culture, this idea of, are we looking for a hero to kind of fill that billet? So one of the things that came up that I think would be the case is, who is General Fortin or any other person in that position going to have at the end of the, on the other end of the phone? Does he know people in the provincial healthcare modalities, or is he going to want to say, I'm going to phone up the division commander, or I'm going to want to phone up, a military officer and have that kind of network relationship? We look at some of the responses to emergencies in Alberta, for example, the response to the Wood Buffalo evacuation. One of the reasons why it went so smoothly, according to some after action reports, was that there was very good communication between provincial emergency management folks and the responding military assets. Well, largely because they were the same people. Most of the people that were working in those on those action desks in Alberta Emergency Management had been in planning roles and senior roles within the Canadian Armed Forces. Took their uniform off on Friday. On Monday, they became civilians. And in the summer, their Rolodex was the right Rolodex to be making those kinds of phone calls. They spoke the same language. They had the same conceptual universe. They had the same vocabulary. And that did allow for some efficiencies. Is General Fortin in that position where he's going to have that kind of, simpatico with the other people on the end of the phone, whether those are vaccine suppliers, whether those are other governmental agencies, whether those are provincial entities who, I don't know, may feel slightly jealous that they've been, pushed aside in order to take this moment away from them, all that kind of petty bureaucratic politics which exists in every organization. So there's a lot of stuff that will be different for General Fortin, not to say that it's insurmountable. And again, when you do things like combined operations and working internationally as he has, you're kind of in that same situation on day one. Your staff isn't necessarily handpicked by you. Someone's there from Poland, someone's there from Italy, someone's there from Belgium. The first step is to kind of create that kind of common operating picture and get people on the same side. But that will be, I think, an interesting challenge, because again, the people that are in his network aren't necessarily the same people that are on his phone list to be able to make this kind of response work as quickly as people, I think, are expecting and hoping.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question. And so what I'd like to put to you is just a very, very general question. And I suspect I might know the answer to this, but I'm really curious to get your take on it. Do you think the pandemic situation we're in right now is going to become a milestone, or like an inflection point in academic discourse going forward? Like 9/11 was, like the Cold War. Are we going to talk about the life pre-COVID, post-COVID, during COVID? And I'm sort of thinking even of like Nicholas Christakis's sort of timeline that he's mapped out over the last few years of where we're going to have like the end of the beginning of the beginning, the end of the beginning of the end, all that stuff. Do you see that this having that same sort of lasting impact as things like Pearl Harbor, 9/11, stuff like that, in terms of
it's interesting that you said in an academic discourse? I think it will be. I think it will be certainly a milestone, although being academics, we will argue about that incessantly, right? Was the end of the Cold War a milestone or was it not? The bleeding of beginnings and ends. And this is one of the things that Mary Zudziak talks about a lot in her book about wartime. It's not just a linear statutory time, things that start at this time and end at that time, but they have a bleeding. I remember asking a question of my students down here in New York, when did the Second World War begin? And of course, they say 1941. Right. The Chinese student in the class, didn't have the same answer. So I think to some extent, it will be a milestone. There will be a before and after. But if we look at the Spanish flu from 1918 and the Asian flu from 1957, for example, those were almost lost to general conventional wisdom, right? People don't really know. People don't talk about the recession that happened after the 1957 Asian flu for many of the same reasons as we're experiencing now. There are not memorials and monuments put up, for example, after the Spanish flu of 1918. People were happy to see the back end of it and moved on. And when those lessons learned were attempted to be invoked by experts, for example, saying, hey, watch out, second wave coming might be worse than the first wave. The fall and winter are going to be worse than the spring and summer in one year and out the other, as I think we can see by the absolutely reckless way in which this has been dealt with by the public and by most governments around the world, right? Those kinds of lessons are not enduring. So I don't really have much confidence that this will sit there and act as some beacon of let's fix this. Because let's be honest, what are the lessons from 9/11? Try to summarize that in 3 or 4 talking points. Very difficult to do, difficult to gain consensus on them. Many people would say the immediate reactions after 9/11 may have been useful or soothing in the beginning, but actually have turned around to be the absolute worst way we could have dealt with things now that we've got the fullness of time, 20 years on. So I'm not sure that we will learn any lessons from COVID-19. So in that sense, I'm not sure what kind of memorial it will actually be. But I think you're right. There will be at least questions that we're asking now, and hopefully some of the questions I've asked today are not questions we would have asked ourselves in 2016 or 2017. But now we do want to say, hey, hang on a second. Do we want the psychological operations brigade of the British Army walking around in London and actually doing outreach campaigns with domestic British citizens? Is that what the British public want? Now's the time to have the conversation before the next time. Similarly in Canada, are we aware of what it means to have a Canadian Armed Forces that has a standing task in, every summer to put out fires and deal with floods? What is the opportunity cost of that? What does it mean in terms of recruitment, in terms of training, in terms of retention, in terms of equipment? All those kinds of issues that we're literally not having on a very wide or deep level right now are the kinds of things, hopefully, this might prompt and stir up.
Right on. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I see the clock. We're almost full time for today's session. And I really want to, like I said, pass on behalf of the center. Thanks to you to kick off our 2021 speaker series. And it was great having you back in the CIDP to share your thoughts. That was a really great conversation. We had a great interaction with the attendees and great take up from the participants as well. So I think this is a really valuable experience. For those of you that are curious and want to share this later, it will be uploaded to our CIDP website, so stay tuned to that, and you can feel free to share that link as widely and broadly as you wish to get the word out, and we can continue to mobilize knowledge. So Chris, thank you so much. If I had you here in person, I would coin you like we do the old-fashioned way, but that'll have to wait till later. So thank you so much, and we'll keep in touch and talk soon.
Thanks for having me, and thanks very much for all the great questions in the Q&A. Hopefully we were able to address a lot of your issues. Cheers.
All right. Take care, everybody. Signing off.